Well, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you all here today. Just a quick reminder that this event is being held on the record. Please do state your name and your institution when it comes to the Q&A bit. You know how that works. Also want to extend a very warm welcome to those of you joining us online. We call this a hybrid event, so lots of people tuning in there. Of course, those of you joining us online will submit your questions via the Q&A function. I will be able to monitor them here, so please do send them in at any point. And you can actually start sending them in right now because we're not going to speak very much on the panel before we start taking questions. So please do have them ready. There's been a bit of a change of plan to today's lineup. Two of our esteemed guests have been struck down with COVID. I'm assured that there's nothing more sinister at play, though the discussion will be no less exciting. Of course, I have with me here Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow of the Eurasia and Russia Program and author of Russia's War on Everybody. Jade McGlynn has been good enough to join us as well, Senior Research Fellow at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in the US. Prior to this, she taught Russian literature at the University of Oxford, where she also completed her DPhil, which examined Russian propaganda and uses of history with a particular focus on coverage of Ukraine since 2014. She is a forthcoming author of Russia's War and Memory Makers, two publications to look out for. And a very warm welcome as well to Edward Lucas, non-resident senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He was formerly senior editor at The Economist. Of course, he's covered Central and Eastern European affairs since 1986, writing, broadcasting, speaking on politics, economics, and security in the region. And of course, as you know, there are copies of the book behind you, so do head towards that table at the end of our discussion. I think maybe the expectation about a book coming at a time like this is that it would focus exclusively on the military threat, the war in Ukraine, but I found that it's actually much broader than that. Events earlier on in the year seemed to move at lightning speed, caught many of us, or some of us, off guard, and often particularly with news coverage, which is what I'm involved in, and the limitations of focusing on what is happening right now, what is happening today, is the absence of background, context, and history, and all the individual events and incidents that can occur over a number of years, which we tend to view as being isolated when they happen at the time, that actually reveal a pattern of behavior. And reading that book felt like putting all the different pieces of that puzzle together without getting into cliches about the Russian enigma. So I think what we have here is context that explains what is happening right now in this new phase of confrontation between Russia and the West. So Keir, let me start by asking you then to give us a bit of background on the book. I know you don't want to spend all your time talking about the book, but also perhaps you could tell us what is the greatest misconception, the thing that people most often get wrong about Russia?
Well, people who've already opened the book will probably have seen that it's actually dedicated to Vladimir Putin for the enormous service that he's done all of us in removing misconceptions. Now, I think there are some people in the room who were here the last time I did this, which was just under 3 years ago, with a different book, one called Moscow Rules, which was precisely about misconceptions that we have in the West about how Russia works, what Russia does, what Russia wants. And before I came here this evening, I had a look back at that event. I had a look back at what I said then. And as always, it's a profoundly depressing experience, because the two key principles that I wanted people to come away with from that event, but which weren't universally believed, were what Russia had convinced itself of. First of all, that it was entitled to empire in a very 1914 sense. And second of all, that it was absolutely convinced that it was already in a state of war with the West in every possible domain except open military clashes. So the misconception, and the biggest one that persisted, was that Russia was actually a country that you could work with as though you were peaceful, cooperative nations, when they had already decided that they were on a different track. And the other thing that came through from that presentation just under 3 years ago was that if the West did not recognize this problem and respond to it appropriately, then the trajectory Russia was on meant that there would inevitably be a worse and deeper and bloodier crisis before long. And so 3 years later, here we are in 2022, and precisely that has happened because the challenge from Russia was not recognized and it was not responded to appropriately. But as Mariam said, this book is not primarily about that. When it says Russia's war on everybody, it is not the war in Ukraine. That is just the most direct and horrific example and illustration of what Russia wants to achieve. It's about the much longer duration and broader in scope war that Russia has been waging for a great deal longer. And as Mariam said, I'm not going to go into great detail about the book, partly because it is such a huge topic that it affects everybody in different ways. It is quite literally everybody. So everybody has their own take and interest in this topic. And that's why we wanted to leave a lot of this session open for questions and answers. But also, I won't be talking for long because we have two expert witnesses here too, both of them deep Russia watchers and deeply imbued in everything that you need to know about how Russia works in order to understand some of those phenomena that you detected. And I'm hoping that we're going to use them to the full to explain this problem of Russia being at war with all of us.
You're being very gracious about not monopolizing this discussion, Keir. So Jade, let me then come to you. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about the Russia's worldview, how it sees its neighboring countries. Does it really believe itself to be under threat?
I think, first of all, I just want to say that how much I enjoyed your book, Keir, and how much it's really a tour de force of quite an astoundingly broad spectrum. But in answer to your question, Mariam, yes, I am Russia. I mean, it's always a bit, I don't want to sound like an academic, but I always struggle a bit with Russia thinks, because clearly there are different factions within Russia. We're talking about the Kremlin. Yes, quite clearly it does perceive the West as a threat. I mean, we can read this in the national security strategy that came out last July. They believe, what sounds a bit like a paradox, that the West is on the verge of collapse and therefore is at its most dangerous. And these two elements are quite important for understanding the thinking and the calculation that have gone into the current war against Ukraine as well, which was that the West, well, if its principles weren't completely for sale at knockdown prices, then they were at least very selectively priced, and that essentially they weren't going to do much to defend Ukraine. And in defense of the Kremlin, which sounds like a weird phrase right now, in their defense, I can see why they fought that. At the same point, of course, the Kremlin has its own sort of myths, and it's very good at making sure that these myths resonate with the Russian people. It's very good at ensuring that, and I think it started to believe, those in the Kremlin started to believe their own propaganda to a certain extent around what the West is actually up to, and that's a longer discussion as to why, and that also goes into sort of psychological issues that I don't know anything about, and thankfully, because I would not want to be Putin's psychotherapist.
Edward, the response to a direct armed assault is obvious, but one of the things the book touches on is that Western powers struggle to respond during an undeclared attack from Moscow. How do you explain hostile measures or actions during times of relative peace, when Russia is not overtly at war with anyone?
Well, I explain them in that they form part of Russia's arsenal of what we now call hybrid warfare measures. I would have called just active measures from the Soviet era, because they have a long history. And they are part of Russia's attempts to play fundamentally divide and rule. That's divide and rule between the United States and Europe, divide and rule within NATO, within the European Union, and divide and rule within countries, finding ethnic, linguistic, demographic, regional, cultural, religious, any other divisions that they can find and whip them up. And that's one that, that's something that is a textbook example of how the Soviet Union conducted its foreign relations, and Russia still does it. I think there's also targeted intimidation measures, and some of the assassinations we've seen have not been. I don't think Sergei Skripal was a particularly important, he wasn't sort of the centerpiece of British intelligence efforts towards Russia. He was semi-retired, but they felt that killing him would send an important message to their own people or to the Brits or to other people that you were able to carry out a nerve agent attack and basically get away with it. Similarly, probably with the Litvinenko. So I think it's, and to me, the Keir's book, which of course which is brilliant, is full of the how. The previous book, Moscow Rules, is about the why. We may want to get onto that in the discussion. But I think the fundamental point is that every bit of our society and our government is part of the attack surface for them. There is, I think, literally nothing that can't be the subject of a hybrid attack from either Russia or the Chinese Communist Party. And we could always find some. We could always, if you look hard enough, you'll find somewhere that they can find a way of getting into it and exploiting it.
Can you talk about unknowing targets, people who don't know their targets that get caught up in it? Because spreading disinformation, which is one of the tools and levers that Russia resorts to, is not just an individual operation. It's just part of daily work. Why do you say that no one is too unimportant to be a target? Why do you say that?
Well, the most obvious application of that is, as you said, it's the disinformation, where if Russia is conducting a whole of society attack, then it is all of society that is the target. And if Russia wants to influence mass consciousness, then that involves targeting masses and getting through to individuals with the disinformation campaigns that we've seen. And you might ask the reason why. Well, Edward talked about divide and rule and setting people against each other by exploiting these divisive issues. And that's a pattern we've seen over and over again, prodding at the things that set people apart, whether it's race in the US or it's Brexit here or it's migration across Europe, finding those issues to divide society. Now, sometimes that is simply because in a zero-sum view of security as you have from Russia, if you make your adversary weaker, then you, by comparison, are stronger. And that's what lies behind some of the apparently completely pointless acts of vandalism that Russia's carried out, such as, for example, sponsoring anti-vaccine movements in target countries well before there was a global pandemic, and then just stepping up the activity when COVID hits. But also, there's another purpose as well. Think about the threat to societal cohesion and people standing together against a common threat and having trust in their institutions and their authorities, which Russia targets. And then project that idea onto Ukraine. And the way Ukrainian resilience has rested upon people standing together and having faith in their institutions and resisting as a group, as a bloc, and being superhumanly resilient. If Russia's campaigns of division succeed, then that doesn't happen, and you are a softer target, and so you fall to Russia. But also, all of the things that now are affecting everybody in our societies. If everybody isn't a target, then why is everybody now feeling the effects on their own pockets of the cost of living crisis triggered by what Putin does with energy? And the effect is psychological as well. The nuclear intimidation and the fear of war with Russia has permeated so deeply in our society. When I'm doing book launches and book signings in bookshops in small market towns around the UK, I see the looks on people's faces as they walk past, catch sight of the cover, and glance hurriedly away and scurry on because they don't want to think about it because it is already a scary topic. And that is a success for Russia, and that targets everyone.
Jade, let me ask you about a little bit of what Keir touched on, the effective disinformation campaigns, which is important. I know you don't want to get into the realms of psychoanalysis, but it feels like we sort of that's where we are when we try to understand how it affects people. Do they really work in changing minds, or does it just reinforce existing bias? Keir was speaking there about how it can cause a social fragmentation, division between people, and this focus on trigger issues, whether it be Brexit in the UK or migration in Europe.
So I think often we tend to think about research into disinformation or into narratives in terms of production and reception. So what narratives is so-and-so saying and how is so-and-so sort of receiving or understanding that. And I think that sometimes we look at it in too much of a binary way. Quite often, I mean, the Kremlin and Russian sort of organizations, not all of which actually are directed by the Kremlin, a lot of which are just vying in what's actually quite a neoliberal environment, vying for some attention from the Kremlin, some money from the Kremlin. That's what we see with the private military contractors as well. But I mean, that's not to say that they're not working in the Kremlin's interests. They are. It's just, it's not Putin sitting there at his desk sort of signing off, yes, this narrative sounds good. But my point is that often they're looking for what works. So they're looking for narratives that resonate. And I think the same is also true actually domestically in sort of Russian news domestically as well. But they're looking for what resonates. And that links into what Edward was saying about divide and rule to a certain extent. So they find problems that are there and then they exploit them. So I don't think it's about changing anybody's mind. I don't think that, for example, anybody was watching RT, anybody was watching, let's say, CNN, and then turned off CNN and went on to RT and were like, oh, okay, wow, I didn't realize that actually, you know, in Syria, they gassed themselves. That didn't happen. But what would have happened is people who were perhaps inclined towards that quite conspiratorial thinking, perhaps, you know, were very, you know, had a real sense of like moral injury because of, let's say, around the US's wars in the Middle East, they might then have been open to certain narratives. And I would say that Russian disinformation abroad, but also domestically at home, is quite good at sort of finding, I suppose, a little nook to get into and then burrowing and then adding in more and more lies. It sometimes reminds me of what Orwell said about, you know, you say that one unspoken truth and then you can pile in loads and loads of lies on top of it. I mean, he said it much nicer than that because he's much more eloquent.
But
still.
yeah, the point is that it sows discord and it creates confusion, and so that's the effect that it has. And I suppose that, you know, they benefit from there not being a very clear dividing line between formal state apparatus and, you know, business, crime groups and various other things. Edward.
Yes. I think they do sometimes change people's minds. I think Ben Nimmo has a good example of how an RT and Russian YouTube videos pretending to show ballot stuffing and irregularities during the Scottish independence referendum actually did succeed bizarrely in casting doubt on the integrity of the count. Though in fact, the people who lost the election, the Scottish nationalists and the pro-independence camp, who would have been the first people to complain if anything had really been going wrong, had absolutely no reservations at all about the way the count had been conducted. But this just a handful of videos, bizarrely actually showing ballot stuffing in Russia, but just put up online of this is how they're moving, this is how they're rigging the election rep, and that did have an effect. So I think there's, I wouldn't underestimate it. But I suppose that the thing that really gets me about this is the complacency in the face of the threat. That we were warned about this right back in the 1990s. The Estonians and Latvians, Lithuanians and Poles and Ukrainians and many other people were saying right back in the early 1990s, watch out, we are already experiencing this. We are experiencing information attacks, dirty money in our politics, the weaponized use of organized crime, other kinds of subversion, intimidation, and so on. And it's hitting us now because we're quite weak and we've just regained our independence, but it will be affecting you soon, and you need to worry about this. And those warnings were not just dismissed. The people who tried to deliver them were belittled and patronized. And probably, I think some people in this room may have firsthand experience of the sort of way in which, for example, the German government responded to quite sensible warnings to the Baltic states about energy security, for example. I myself was in the Kanzleramt in 2005, warning them that they might be subject to information warfare. And they said, Herr Lucas, are you seriously saying that the Federal Republic of Germany would suffer information attack from Russia? And I said, duh, yes. And they literally laughed. They could not conceive that the mighty German information space would be vulnerable. And what I'm really missing from this is any sense of contrition. We now have tens of thousands of people dead, hundreds of thousands of people maimed and traumatized, millions of people are homeless or refugees, and a $1 trillion bill. And I think that is the direct result of us ignoring these hybrid attacks on our societies over the last 30 years. And I hear only the Finnish Prime Minister in the whole of the Old West, expressing any contrition at all for having not listened to these warnings earlier.
So Edward, on a related point, you've focused in your research about London being a destination for Russian money. One thing to ignore, but then also in some cases, we have been facilitators. And here you mention in the book this toxic influence on British policy and politics. And this remarkable statistic from economist Timothy Ash, based on actually Russian central bank statistics, that $1.6 trillion have left the country since 1994. 30% of that, or 500 billion, is estimated to have gone to the UK. So that means fees for banks, asset management companies, money brings influence. If our systems have been corrupted by Russian money, politicians and regulators have let it happen, then, well, you know, can we put all the blame on Russia? Is our own politics
No,
not
our
right there?
enablers? I mean, this would be so much less effective if it wasn't for the bankers and lawyers and accountants and fixers and grifters and snoopers who do the dirty work of the worst people on the planet. And I want to say a particular welcome to anyone who's watching this online or indeed in the audience, from Schillings, Mishcon de Rare and Carter Ruck, for your indefatigable attempts to make sure that we can't talk about this in public. I was the first witness to the Intelligence and Security Committee inquiry into Russia, and it was only then, protected by both parliamentary privilege and official secrecy, that I was actually able to tell the MPs in blunt, unvarnished terms what really goes on in this country and what they should be investigating. And I think they did investigate, and the result of that was an extremely interesting report, which Boris Johnson made great attempts to make sure would never never see the light of day.
So just you talk about the UK's legal system being used against it because...
Well, the SLAPs, the strategic lawsuits against public participation, mean that if you tell the truth, I within 10 words of where I am now, could land myself in a position where I would have to sell my house to pay my legal fees. That wouldn't be the case if I was talking in the United States.
Maybe we go to questions. With that in mind, and giving everyone here hopefully a voice as well. Unless there's anything more you wanted to add to that, Keir, I'm happy to go to questions.
No, absolutely.
We've got some questions coming in online as well. If you could state your name and your institution. This gentleman here with the glasses.
Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Jeremy Mee, and I'm at the London School of Economics. My question is there anything, I guess I'll stand. Is there anything that you think the West or the US could have done differently after the fall of the Soviet Union to better integrate Russia into the world community? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? That's a good question.
I resent the framing of that question, actually. I think the first question in 1991 should have been what's really happened. And yes, the planned economy collapsed. And yes, the political monopoly of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had collapsed. Had the Soviet Empire collapsed? Well, actually not really. And I think the first thing we should have said to Russia was, you're absolutely welcome to integrate into the world community, but you will have to treat your former colonies decently. You will have to treat Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and all the other ones with the same respect and sensitivity that West Germany treats France, the Netherlands, Denmark, or for that matter, Israel. And I remember having this conversation in 1996, I think it was, with a Kremlin official. He said, why are you always getting at us? What's fundamentally, what's the problem here? Why won't you take it seriously? And I said, until you treat Estonia, just as an example, until you treat Estonia as a proper country, you will never have proper relations with the West. And he said, but Estonia is not a proper country. And that fundamentally is the problem. While Russia remains an empire and has imperial pretensions over its internal, particularly external empire, it cannot have be integrated in the West because we take countries like Estonia as serious, and we're right to do so.
There's another issue that might lead on from that question. And just as a preface, as an aside, going back to the disinformation point and whether Russian disinformation narratives do convince people or not. Another part of the book signing experience for this is going to, again, small towns, talking about what Russia does and being told from the back that I've got it all wrong because, and then a long stream of narratives that have come directly from Moscow, including about the ongoing war in Ukraine and a lot of things that require suspension of disbelief to belief. So yes, it is penetrating into our societies. But I mention that because one of the myths that Russia has propagated that has permeated all of the discussion about this is the idea that the West did not help Russia after 1991, that it actually did its best to make things worse for Russia, to exploit it, to humiliate it, all of the usual words that you hear from Russia, which is the opposite of what actually happened, because every possible effort was made not only to prop Russia up by pouring in billions in aid and massive amounts of food because the country was unable to feed itself, but also to try to tie it into the international community by any means possible. From the entirely spurious granting of a UN Security Council seat to Russia, and look at the pernicious consequences of that now, right all the way down through business, through non-governmental organizations, through all of the different ways in which Russia was welcomed in. All of that now has been as cleanly forgotten within Russia as Lend-Lease in the Second World War was during the Soviet Union, because it's not convenient. And instead, they have to tell themselves the story that the West was evil and tried its best to take advantage of Moscow.
I think just to come back on that, just before we go to questions, but I think it's an important point, because that myth of well, it's not a myth. I mean, the 1990s was clearly very horrible, and not just for Russians. And that's sort of my point though around disinformation, was that you have this resonance where obviously a lot of Russians have very bad, well, over 79% of Russians have terrible memories of this time. And then Putin has been, and the Kremlin have been very adept at making the West to blame for those memories, rather than the people who were actually to blame, which is probably a slightly different conversation. But I mean, in answer to your question, I have to admit I'm not a fan of the framing either, I'm afraid. But I do think that there needed to be a lot more honesty about what was happening in Russia. I mean, even now you hear this framing that, oh, okay, Putin, Russia was a democracy, and then Putin took it off. And I think it's a strange democracy that shoots its own government, the White House, the Russian White House in 1993. And I mean, that was not a fair and honest election in 1996. And whilst I can understand why people didn't want somebody like Zyuganov, who's certainly I wouldn't care to vote for him, to be president. I mean, has it helped us in the long run that happened? Just that's a question I don't know the answer.
There's a lady here. Could we, in blue?
Hi, I'm Thea. I'm a PhD student at King's College. My question is, first of all, thank you, all of you, about your expertise. But despite we have seen how Russia is working, despite what we heard, they did not recognize their neighbors as a countries. Despite in 2008, they invaded Georgia and did not respond to the West properly. And next we have seen in 2014, war in Ukraine, next in 2015 in Syria, and now what's going on, we all see. Do you think the West is ready to answer properly what Russia is doing right now? One is, we are interested in what's going in Russia. Maybe it's a time to more interesting what the West response should be in this situation, instead of pushing Ukraine to go and negotiate, work to defeat Russia in Ukraine completely, politically and militarily.
So you're saying, what more can the West do?
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. Thank
Two
you.
elements to that. And the answer in both cases is no. There is the general recognition of the Russia problem and the full understanding of what that means, not only for the frontline states, but for the rest of us. We still hear from Macron just very recently, the idea that you can return to a state before February 24th this year, and that would be peace, which is a nonsense. But also dealing with Russia's methods, and my apologies to the people who are in the room who heard this discussion just a few days ago, but the fact that we respond to Russia's campaign of destruction in Ukraine, a campaign that goes against all of the values that all of us hold, a means of winning the war by inflicting the maximum possible misery and suffering on the innocent civilian population. How does the West respond to Russia destroying all of this critical civilian infrastructure in order to trigger humanitarian catastrophes? It sends more infrastructure for Russia to destroy. It is like witnessing a school shooting and sending in more children instead of addressing the problem at source. And the problem is the way Russia thinks it is normal and natural and right to wage war. And unless and until we see somebody saying that, no, Russia, this is not acceptable, then we are playing Russia's game by Russia's rules. And that is another symptom of a complete failure to recognize what the problem is that's facing us.
Can I just add that if we had sent 10 months ago 1/10 of what we've sent to Ukraine since, there wouldn't be a war. It reminds me very much of the Bosnian War in the 90s, where hundreds and then thousands of Bosnians had to die in order that the West then got the courage to take its red line and move it a little bit. So our red lines have gone from send only defensive weapons to send only these weapons, send only that weapons, to do this, to do that. And at each stage, we do something that we previously said we couldn't do. And the reason why we've decided to do it is we just feel a bit more guilty because there's been a bit more death and destruction. And that's really disgusting. You know, our geopolitical education is being paid for in the blood and tears of people who are innocent and whose soldiers are fighting and dying for our freedom as well as theirs. And we sit here in this kind of self-indulgent, introverted, ponderous foreign policy discussion. I think particularly the Germans here, wondering about, you know, what the new Friedensordnung is going to be like in Europe. And I just think, have you any idea what's happening a day's drive from your well-upholstered diplomatic salon? I see Ewan's had his hand up for a long time.
There are quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of people. Well, quickly, if you keep your questions short, we'll get to as many as possible. So,
thank you for the panel. Lovely speech by all of you. Now, the question I want to ask on the title of the conference, it says Russian war on everybody, or is it really the war on everybody's war on Russia? That's part A of the question. Part B, if we're talking about really Russia being an empire, an aggressive empire, which is bigger? Is it US empire bigger or Russian empire is bigger? Thank you.
Well, nobody, sorry.
We did have a ground rule that we're not wasting time on the usual routines of whataboutism. So we can move on to the next question.
okay. Now, the gentleman at the back, he's right at the back.
Thank you very much indeed. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. So nice to hear Germany getting a good press up the front as ever. We certainly know something about reasons turning into excuses pretty quickly in Berlin over these last months. I think for many of us, I'd just like to second very quickly what Edward just said about this disgusting behavior of only giving Ukraine the new weapons when another massacre happens. And I'm sure for most of us, Ukraine is our absolute priority and Ukraine's victory is our absolute priority now. But what I think Keir does is a really good service of putting that into a wider context. And I'd just like to pick up a couple of things that were mentioned in the talk on that regard. The term attack surface was used, and it was mentioned also that there was a whole of society challenge, if you like, that Russia poses. I would put it to the room that actually, rather than an attack surface, it's that Russia works in the cracks that we make for ourselves, and it exploits cracks that are already there. Taking this on as a whole of society challenge means actually having a whole of society theory of victory or a whole of society theory of continuous winning. And I'd like to hear, without it going into self-indulgent navel gazing, actually, what it is that actually the West does need to do to take more of our people with us on the road to not only defending democracy, but actually renewing it in a serious way that will prepare us for the challenge of authoritarian regimes to come. Thank you.
Sorry.
Go for it. You go first.
I think our policy starts from ignorance, and ignorance begets arrogance, and arrogance begets complacency. And above all of them is greed. And we thought in 1991 that it was the end of history and all we really need to do is to get on and make money. And I think money's been the Achilles heel of the West. It's been the greed, particularly of our enablers, but in a way of all of us, that we've decided that the most important thing is to get stuff cheap, make a profit, and not worry about the geopolitics and national security. And that's fundamentally what's got to change. We have to look at trade and investment through a national security lens and not just through a narrow economic one. And that's true whether we're dealing with China and thinking about rare earths, which aren't actually rare, they're just expensive to difficult to refine, but we buy them all from China, whether it's about the gas dependency, which we've allowed to build up on Russia, and many other things as well. So I think that the sea change that we need as a result of this, and as a result of all this appalling suffering in Ukraine, it's to realize that freedom doesn't come free. Sometimes you have to pay for it.
And in terms of practical steps, Edward mentioned the key problem is ignorance, and dispelling that ignorance, it's been proven time and again, is the first thing that needs to be done in order that people can protect themselves against the problem. We've seen over and over again that as soon as a country or a society or a group admits that it is under attack by Russia, that triggers a lot of other things happen. It means that they are empowered to defend themselves. And that could be as simple as a president or a prime minister or a defense minister simply stating the state of affairs and what Russia is doing. And that means that business and media and government can start to actually take appropriate defensive measures, which is precisely the opposite of the situation we have in this country, where not only was the report that Edward referred to, the Intelligence and Security Committee reports from July 2020, simply called Russia, suppressed for as long as the government could manage it, but also, since it was published, how many of the vulnerabilities that, Benjamin, you're talking about, that were identified in that report, much to the astonishment of the MPs, have actually been plugged? I believe the answer is 0.
Well, I think the security of the House of Commons has slightly improved.
If I just come quickly onto Ben's point, because I think it's a really important one. And I've been thinking about this recently in terms of a lot of the time when speaking to people, they ask, okay, how can we sort of defeat Russia? How do we do this? And bluntly, we can't necessarily defeat Russia. We can defeat Russia in Ukraine, but I think the important thing is to make sure that Ukraine wins. And that may sound like sophistry, but it's not. They're different. And I think making sure that we have a strategy, that we're not just reacting to massacres, or to further atrocities, but that we actually have a long-term strategy of how to protect Ukraine as much as possible and to defend it, to make sure that we can actually invest, that the other businesses want to reinvest in the reconstruction, to make sure as much we can keep certain parts of it safe. We need to have this longer term vision. And also I think for our own society, and again, it's a sort of like the catchphrase of be brave like Ukraine, because if you think back to 2013, 2014, Ukrainians decided not to take the money. They decided not to take the cheap energy deal. And I'm afraid that you can't say that for a lot of Western European countries.
In fact, just one other thing, I think what's really stood out for me since February is that the failure to get the global South on board is the harvest we are reaping from 30 years of ignoring, patronizing, mistreating the countries outside the West. We won't get the East-West stuff right, whether it's with Russia or with China, when we have countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia saying, we don't trust you. We don't trust you because of the way you run the world economy. We don't trust you because of the way you handle COVID. We don't trust you because of Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't trust you for whatever. And the idea that an imperialist war conducted by Russia doesn't receive the support of countries such as South Africa, it receives the support and not the hostility of countries like South Africa, which define themselves as anti-imperialist, is really shocking. We should really be asking ourselves very hard questions about how that's come about.
So they are winning the battle of the narrative across much of it.
I wouldn't say they're winning, they're doing far better than they should be. And the fact the Varda Group does so well in Africa, that what we've seen in Mali is an extraordinary failure of French and Western policy. And if anyone had said 15 years ago the Russians are going to be back in Africa, people would have said, what are you smoking? They're never going to get back. And yet there they are.
But they've been invited back by.
They've been invited back because we've screwed up.
Question, this lady here.
Thank you. Gabriela Szydlowskaite, University College London. So there's been a lot of talk in the media that the Baltic states now should feel vindicated because their warnings about Russia are finally being heeded. However, I recently came back from Lithuania and there's this general sense of them not really feeling safe by their NATO membership in the face of Russian imperialism. And I wanted to ask, do you agree with that type of skepticism? have the Baltic states finally made it to the status of real country, and what's their role in the future of international politics and this conflict in particular? Thank you.
That may-
Unfortunately, if you ask countries around Europe whether the Baltic states have made it to the status of real countries, it's probably not only Russia that says not yet. But at the same time, they are the safest that they have been in centuries, simply because they finally got NATO to do what it was supposed to and put in place enhanced forward presence so that Baltic states couldn't be picked off one by one if Russia had chosen that one of them was to be the next target instead of Ukraine. Simply by having in place contingents from other NATO nations removes that whole conversation immediately about how NATO would respond if there were some kind of overt assault against the Baltic states as opposed to the covert ones. However, it's an unfortunate accident of geography that affects not just them, but all of that Russia's western periphery, that it doesn't matter how much protection you have from NATO, you are never going to be completely safe if you get into a situation like Ukraine did, where the West is giving a green light to Putin to go ahead, both through what it says and through what it does in the lead up to the invasion. So there is reason to be happy with what has happened about the actual direct protection of the Baltic states, but there's never going to be a situation where they can feel completely safe until we have a very, very different Russia, and that is going to be not in my lifetime.
And I also think we need a very different NATO, because what we have at the moment is a kind of NATO light in the Baltic states, that it's all based really on deterrence rather than defense. And NATO needs to change its doctrine pretty profoundly in terms of defense first rather than deterrence first. We need to radically rethink our command structure for Northern Europe. I hope we get a new Northern Command based in Britain. I think that would be a very good thing. But if you look at what NATO does in the Baltic states, it's what the Brits call Heath Robinson and what the Americans have called Rube Goldberg. It's a series of improvisations and sort of workarounds. We don't have a proper standing defense plan. The stockpiles are far, far too low. I mean, the Western troops based in the Baltics have measured their ammunition in days when they should be, we don't, and everything depends on the United States. And that is an enormous bet now. It depends particularly on the United States stockpile in Norway, which is a Marine base. And the Marines are now turning into a coastal raiding force of the Pacific rather than being the part of a conventional war in Europe. So the ground is shifting very quickly under our feet. And even if the United States wants to help, they may just be busy. So Europe, I think the fundamental point is Europe is strategically naked. We've realized it because of the Ukraine war. And because we're strategically naked, the most exposed countries are right to be worried. And we have an awful lot of work to do.
Okay.
So many questions.
Yes, so let's just take three in one go. So the guy at the back with the longish hair. If you just ask your question and then, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Max. I work for the Charity Commission. Thank you to the panel. Is Russia's war on the 1.5 billion people in China as well, or does their partnership really know no limits?
Russia, China.
We need three, are we?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, so Russia, China, and then just pass the mic to that gentleman there with the glasses, yeah.
Hi, my name is Arman. I'm at the University of Edinburgh. I just wanted to ask, you spoke about the global south briefly. I wanted to know if hybrid warfare from Russia looks different outside the West. For example, you talked about pumping in dirty money, weaponizing organized crime. Are those the kind of measures they use, for example, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Central Asia? If you could talk a bit about that, please. Thank you.
And just, yes, this guy here.
This
Yes.
by Ian Bond.
Hi, Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. So the book's called Russia's War on Everybody. And I tend to agree with that. But some people will say, well, isn't it Putin's war on everybody? So, I mean, it's partly a question for Jade, but to what extent is the narrative that Putin's been pushing for the last 20 odd years so far under the skins of the Russian population that even if Putin disappeared tomorrow, the same mindset, the same war thinking would continue?
Sounds like it's Russia, China, methods in the global south, and is it Putin or is it Russia?
Sounds good.
Yes, I mean, I think our problems with Russia predate Putin and will outlast him. And anyone who doesn't think that wasn't paying attention in the 90s. China is not pleased about this war. We don't know whether Russia really warned Xi Jinping what he was going to do, but certainly they would have told him that it was going to be over in days, and it's not. It's led to high prices for food, fuel, and fertilizer, which China doesn't like. It's blurred the edges of nuclear doctrine, which China also doesn't like, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like. And I think that there's clearly pressure from the Chinese Communist Party leadership on Russia on the nuclear side. They absolutely hate this nuclear saber rattling. I'd recommend very strongly another excellent book called Overreach by Owen Matthews, which has an interesting scoop in it about the back channel between the United States and China relating to the war in Ukraine. And it certainly fits many of the known facts. And I think that the Chinese it's very striking the fact that China has not supplied any of the things that Russia really wants. No munitions, no drones, no serious help with sanction busting, no trucks. Russia desperately needs trucks because their logistics are so rubbish. And China's not doing that. So something's making China hold very far back from this. I would be not surprised if in the end game, China plays more of a role as well.
I'll try to be super brief. Do we see the methods that are directed against the West being employed elsewhere? Yes, we do. Of course, it depends entirely on the target because the influence and the effects are tailored to the target. And you can tell that by the way that they are most successful when they are employed not against the leadership of a given country, but actually in cooperation with the leadership of a given country. Because if you take examples of the spectacular Russian successes like Mali, as Edward referred to, like Burkina Faso, like Central African Republic, it is where the local leadership has found the Russian offer attractive. Because let's not forget that not everybody agrees with our system of government, and some leaderships around the world want actually to be protected against their population in precisely the same way that the Russian leadership sees its own subjects as a threat. So the nature of the measures that Russia's taken are actually fully in tune with some of the nastiest regimes around the world, and that, in effect, is why they quite often work.
To come to Ian's point, I very much think that this is Russia's war, which is why I went to the effort of writing a book with that title. Yeah. But and I don't think it's possible even to talk about sort of Putin pushing. It's not because Putin's been pushing these narratives for 20 years. It's that these narratives existed. And that's actually why the Kremlin media, pro-Kremlin media, state-affiliated media uses them, is because they resonate. Of course, then it manipulates them and tries to make sure that it feeds their interests more, or to co-opt them. But it's not that it just sort of created these out of thin air and imposed them on the population. And we can see this as well. I mean, there's lots of studies, for example, that are looking into Russian patriotism. So you have sort of two different forms of patriotism. Generally, you have the sort of the benign form of, okay, I like my country, it's where I'm from, it's where I belong. And then and Russians are entirely not at all peculiar on that. There's sort of normal rankings. And what you also have is this sort of my country, right or wrong, the less benign forms of patriotism, which are that my country's interests should be pursued even if they hurt others. And there, even in the 1990s and throughout in the early Putin years, we see Russians scoring incredibly highly. If we look at the World Value Survey, if we look at these surveys that have gone on since 1993. And so that's before Putin sort of that's before the Munich speech, that's before anything else. So Putin is responding, he's articulating something that's in Russian society. Now, why that's in Russian society is a very, very long conversation that's not for here, but yeah, not in 11 minutes. But I think it's important to understand that differentiation.
So maybe three more, if we could do a quick round.
Ewan has had his hand up the back since before the question started.
Then before the question started. Okay. Is there a microphone?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Edward. Ewan Grant. I've worked in EU programs in Ukraine. I'm not the only person in this room who has done that. There's at least one other person, and believe you me, we can tell you all that Edward's article in the Times yesterday was spot on. absolutely spot on. My question for you all is, when you meet a Russian and discuss the war, or even by implication, what do you see in their eyes? And the second question is the same question, but for Germans. Thank you.
Thank you.
I saw Wagnerism 24 years ago, and Edward is 100%.
That's
Our failure to call that out is coming back to us now.
Question.
Thank you, Sean Curtin, member of Chatham House. So thank you for all the stimulating analysis. I'd like to ask you about what is perhaps after Ukraine the biggest threat to NATO. Is it Kaliningrad, the enclave that if you visit Lithuania or Poland, people are very worried about that issue because of the use of Belarus as a sort of platform for Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And one brief point about Edward's comment about Sanna Marin, the Finnish Prime Minister. Isn't it rather easy for her to acknowledge past mistakes since she's only 37 years of age? Thank you.
One more, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. James Nixie, Chatham House. You've spoken very eloquently about the pernicious influence of enablers and the corporate sector, the need for compulsion to make money from Russia. How would you evaluate how crucial to the situation that we're in has been the naivete of diplomacy and diplomats?
Right.
I'm very
Diplomats, eyes and
I have just a very quick comment on, I think that James's point there is right on naivete, and I think it comes back as well to the point around ignorance and having people who are sort of generalists maybe being too involved in foreign policy.
It's the fact that Keir isn't working in government anymore tells you everything you need to know about the way our government treats its Russia experts. On the looking at the eyes, I mean, obviously there's no such thing as a standard Russian, but I mean, I meet a lot of Russians in London. I meet a lot of Germans, and I speak Russian and German. And the thing that jars most is self-pity. There's an extraordinary ability to make this all about Russia. You know, we had to leave our country. Your sanctions are making my life miserable. This is a catastrophe. Putin is just as bad for Russia as it was for us. We suffered most under communism, and so on. And there's an inability to center the narrative, the discourse on Ukraine, which I find quite jarring. With Germans, I think it's Orientalism. This idea that there are big countries are what matter. Russia's a big country. We have this deep spiritual bond going back to Catherine the Great. We get Russia in a way that you don't. We're both continental superpowers, and all these countries in between are kind of, you know, Tajikistan. I mean, they're not real countries, and it's and in an odd way that kind of echoes Russia's, which isn't Orientalism, but sort of, you know, patronizing attitudes. I mean, I don't understand why it matters that I mean, any politician who apologizes for their country's mistakes in the past is better than a politician who doesn't. Obviously, I'd far rather that President Steinmeier apologized for the sanctimonious, greedy, and colossally irresponsible policy that he pursued as foreign minister. But we wait on that one. But for the meantime, I will happily take Sanna Marin.
There are two very distinct groups of categories, say, of Russian citizen or former Russian citizen with whom I have conversations about the war. There's one group that I talk to, not face-to-face, but for professional reasons, that are fully in favor of the war and think it should just be done better, harder, faster, and they can't understand why Ukraine isn't yet crushed. And there's the other group, which tends to have been outside Russia for sufficiently long that they have a slightly different view, and they are the ones who are appalled and horrified and throw themselves wholeheartedly into supporting the cause of Ukraine, including simple things like, for example, joining me in volunteering at local support groups for displaced Ukrainians needing help navigating British bureaucracy, etc. And there is no commonality between the two groups whatsoever. So up to a point, you're absolutely right. You can't generalize about Russia, which is why there's a lengthy disclaimer in the front of the book saying, when we say Russia, we mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because otherwise you have to put it in every single time you mention Russia through the book, and that gets a bit tedious. But I would agree absolutely with Jade. This is not a Putin problem. We've established a long time ago that it's far deeper than that. Which means that, coming back to the question about where does the threat to NATO come from, it's a slightly strange phrasing from the question because, of course, Ukraine was not a threat to NATO, or rather Russia's threats to Ukraine were not, strictly speaking, a NATO issue. But what makes it one is recognition of the underlying problem. And that is the threat. Rather than in a specific geographical area, it is just the attitude of Russia. The attitude that the countries around it should not be sovereign, independent nations, which have a right to determine their own future, but instead they should be under Russia's domination. Now, some of those countries are members of NATO and members of the EU. Therefore, that clash, that conflict is not going to go away until Russia does, and Russia's not going away.
Just that point, actually, I mean, still what's called Putin's ultimatum. So the idea that NATO should agree to go back to its 1997 borders and essentially not have any of the countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, that's still being discussed in diplomatic circles by people who are what would have been known previously as the sort of westernizer realists, in the sense that, you know, they don't love the war, they don't really understand why it's being fought, not because they in any way are good people who feel sorry for Ukraine, but just because it's damaging Russia's prestige, and they understand that. And they're still saying, oh, perhaps there could be some sort of agreement where it goes back to Putin's ultimatum. You're like, no, because nobody takes that seriously in the West. That's insane. And then they say, well, why don't you take it seriously? Is it because you don't take Russia seriously? Like, no, because it's just not in any way a serious suggestion. And I think that difference between mindsets, between sort of what is actually happening and what is possible in the world is enormous. It's vast. And then finally, I also wanted to come on to your point here there about the polarization. I mean, the amount of people, I speak to a lot of pro-war people, and I also, of course, having lived in Russia for a very long time, I have a lot of Russian friends who, it won't be a surprise, are not pro-war. And when I speak to my Russian friends who are not pro-war, they say, oh, I don't know anybody who supports this war. And then when I speak to the people who are pro-war, they say, oh, I don't know anybody who's against the war. Everybody's for this war. And I find that always interesting. Yeah,
can I just, on the diplomats, I do think it is really scandalous the way that we have misplayed this from a diplomatic point of view. We were really good during the Cold War at Sovietology and at dealing with the Soviet Union. Our intelligence services had fantastic insights, chiefly thanks to Gordievsky, but also for other reasons. And we had a really a world-class ability to do this. And we just destroyed it. We destroyed it partly because we didn't think that the geopolitics was still going on. There's a former British ambassador to Moscow, who I won't mention by name because who knows, he may know a libel law, who actually said his job in Moscow was to promote British trade and investment. He said, I'm representing Britain PLC. That's why I'm there. And that was so fundamentally wrong. It's really, really shocking. And we also got rid of, we got rid of all the expertise, and we gave them the wrong jobs, the wrong tasking. And there used to be a phrase in the Foreign Office called Crazy Edward Lucas talk. I remember that very clearly from sort of 2002. There's a phrase, Crazy Edward Lucas talk. Yeah.
Put that one next, on the back of your next book.
Maybe just one more question.
Anyone here from Ukraine? I think we should have Ukrainians.
Yes, is this lady here Ukrainian? Both of you? Both Ukrainian?
Orestia, say something.
Well, thank you. I don't actually have a question prepared, but I first of all wanted to say huge thank you for actually bringing this subject and talking about the threat of Russia beyond Ukraine, because I can't believe how many of my friends here still ask me, well, can't Ukraine just agree to some deal and it will be done with and we'll all be happy ever after? And it's, I've been living in the UK for 22 years, and it pained me for the last at least 10 years to see the lack of understanding in the West of what was really happening, and ignoring the messages from Ukraine, particularly Ukrainian politicians and all that. And basically, people, as I said, trying to play a nice game with Russia while they were doing really, unheard things. And all the propaganda, I think Putin, we're saying Russia and Putin are kind of maybe the same, but I think Putin has created fascism in Russia, in terms of he pushed the idea, what was, some idea of what they had, in terms of attitude to other countries, to an extreme. And he created a propaganda, that for years we've ignored what was happening with Russia TV and everything. In fact, we kind of played I refer to myself now as a British person, but so I just wanted to say big thank you to the panel and for, I'm looking forward to reading the book. I think this is invaluable conversation. I hope you'll take it kind of further because we need to learn. My brother is on the front line. My parents, for days without electricity and power, and they all stand, hope, because they believe they have something to fight for. And I think we owe it not just to Ukraine, but to ourselves and to the world to make this right. And so all those tens of thousands of people have not died in vain.
That feels like a really good note on which to conclude this. So thank you very much. And I'm really pleased that we got to hear from someone who is from Ukraine in this discussion. And I think it sort of brought together a couple of those points really well. Sort of naivety of diplomats, and Keir mentions in the book Russia being able to use this sort of fear of escalation that we have in the West, and mentioning possible use of nuclear weapons, something that creates a lot of chaos and discussion in the media, particularly, but also more important questions about how to repair that ignorance at a time when trust is eroding.